The park was alive with the sounds of a sunny afternoon. Birds chirping, children laughing, joggers moving along the paths. Among the crowd sat Mike Tyson on a bench, enjoying a rare moment of anonymity. Dressed in a hoodie and sunglasses, he blended in with the regular park-goers, not looking to draw attention, but simply seeking a moment to relax after a grueling schedule. Officer Thomas patrolled the park, cutting an imposing figure. His gait exuded overconfidence, bordering on arrogance. His reputation for profiling anyone who didn't fit his narrow-minded view of who belonged where was notorious, and it was clear he relished the power his badge afforded him. As he made his rounds, his piercing gaze landed on Tyson, sitting solitary on the bench, minding his own business. Instantly, Thomas's prejudice flared, his assumptions fueling a dangerous conviction. The officer's mind worked in dangerous ways, each thought fueled by his biased worldview. He tightened his grip on his baton, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Under his breath, he muttered to himself in a low, snide tone, "What's a guy like him doing here, dressed like that?" The implication was clear. Tyson, with his hooded sweatshirt and sunglasses, didn't fit Thomas's narrow vision of someone who belonged in the park on such a beautiful day. To Thomas, anyone who wasn't actively engaging in an activity was immediately suspect. As Officer Thomas advanced toward Tyson, his heavy boots ground against the gravel with each determined step. His air of authority thickened with every inch he drew closer. With zero preamble or even a polite greeting, his voice barked out, piercing the air. "Hey, you. What are you doing here? You can't just loiter around." Tyson was caught off guard by the sudden intrusion into his peaceful reverie. He gazed up at the officer with surprise and a hint of annoyance, his calm facade slipping just slightly. His sunglasses, once a shield against the glares and stares of those around him, were slowly lowered. The deliberate movement of his hand revealed eyes that were sharp and piercing, reflecting a deep well of knowledge and confidence. As he met Thomas's accusatory gaze, Tyson's voice remained even and composed, with an undercurrent of authority that demanded respect. "I'm just enjoying the park," Tyson said, his words landing like a pebble in a calm pond, rippling through the tense silence that had descended upon the park. Officer Thomas sneered, his features twisting into a grotesque mask of derision. His lip curled into an arrogant display of contempt as he sneered, "People like you shouldn't be here, just lingering around." Tyson's eyes remained locked on the officer's, his expression unwavering. "People like me?" he asked, his voice tinged with quiet curiosity. Thomas, anger building in his chest, shot back, "Yeah, people like you. This isn't a place for someone like you to hang out all day. Move along." The command was given with an air of superiority, the veins on his neck throbbing as he glared down at Tyson. The tension between the two men was palpable, rapidly escalating. Tyson's expression shifted slightly, a single eyebrow arching in a quizzical motion. The corner of his mouth twitched, a subtle flicker of irritation crossing his face as he asked again, "People like me? What's that supposed to mean?" Without waiting for an answer, Tyson slowly stood up, towering over the officer. The sudden shift in posture sent a wave of apprehension through Thomas's chest. What had started as a routine confrontation now seemed to be escalating into something more dangerous. Officer Thomas wasn't used to this kind of resistance. His hand tightened around his baton, his body tense with anger. "I said move along," he repeated, his voice more forceful now, laced with the kind of authority he expected people to obey. Tyson's eyes never left Thomas as he took a step forward, his presence almost suffocating. "You're not in control here," Tyson said, his voice calm, but there was an undeniable weight to his words. Thomas's rage boiled over. Without thinking, he swung his baton, striking Tyson on the back. The sound of the blow echoed through the park, causing a few onlookers to gasp. But Tyson, far from crumbling under the assault, merely turned around slowly, his expression unreadable. The officer's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't going as he'd expected. "You messed with the wrong person." Tyson's voice was cold now, every word sharp with an unspoken threat. The few onlookers who had gathered began to take notice, sensing that something wasn't right. The air around them seemed to grow thick, as if the whole park was holding its breath. Thomas stepped back, uncertain now. He could feel the shift in the dynamic, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. "You need to leave before I make you," he said, though his voice wavered, betraying his doubt. Tyson's eyes flashed, and in that moment, Officer Thomas knew he had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't just about authority anymore. It was about facing the consequences of his actions. "Not today," Tyson replied, his voice steady, as the crowd began to close in around them. The park had fallen silent save for the sound of officers approaching. But this time, Officer Thomas wasn't the one in control. As the story unfolded, Officer Thomas was about to learn a hard lesson about power, respect, and the consequences of his actions. Officer Thomas's patience was wearing thin. His grip on the baton tightened to a white-knuckled grasp, the air around him crackling with the palpable tension of impending violence. His body coiled like a spring ready to explode. "Don't play smart with me," he snarled, his voice resonating with a venomous edge, each word punctuating his barely contained fury. "I'm giving you a direct order. Get up and leave." The command was barked out, punctuated by a vicious flick of the baton, an attempt to intimidate and force Tyson into compliance. But Mike Tyson's resolve remained unyielding. His steely gaze never wavered, and his posture was as firm as ever. It was a testament to his unshakable composure. His voice remained even, almost too calm for the situation, his words measured with an authority that left no room for doubt. "Officer, I'm not breaking any laws. I have every right to sit here," Tyson declared, his words laced with an air of quiet authority, the defiance in them undeniable. He wasn't going anywhere. The challenge in his voice only served to fuel Officer Thomas's growing fury, like throwing gasoline onto a fire. Thomas's face contorted with rage, his features flushing crimson. The veins in his neck pulsed with the intensity of his fury, as his grip on the baton morphed into a weaponized extension of his emotions. "Are you resisting me?" His tone was primal, a growl that reverberated through the park, demanding a response. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge, one that Tyson knew he couldn't back down from. Thomas's desire to dominate Tyson overwhelmed his sense of reason, his anger boiling over. With a sudden, unrestrained motion, Officer Thomas swung his baton with brutal force. The strike connected with Tyson's back with a sickening thud, the air around them seeming to freeze in shock. The sound of the impact was deafening, and the surrounding onlookers jumped back, their faces painted with disbelief. Frantic fingers scrambled to whip out their phones, trying to document the horror unfolding before them. For a moment, Tyson sat motionless, as if the attack hadn't fazed him, but then, slowly, he rose from the bench, his form unfurled with languid grace, betraying the simmering fury within him. His commanding stature became evident as his broad shoulders and towering height sent a clear message to Officer Thomas. The transformation was subtle, but profound. His expression shifted from serene composure to a cold, controlled fury, his gaze locking onto Thomas with an intensity that radiated danger. The coiled energy within Tyson's body was palpable, a testament to the physical prowess that had made him a legend in the ring. He stood still for a moment, every muscle tensed, his hands clenching into fists, veins bulging as his body prepared for what was to come. He didn't need to speak to communicate the threat in his eyes. The message was clear. Tyson's words, when they came, were measured, each syllable dripping with menace. His voice was a low growl, simmering with restrained power. "Big mistake," he said, the quiet fury in his tone chilling. The calmness of his voice made the threat all the more terrifying. Officer Thomas, once the aggressor, now found himself face to face with an adversary whose formidable size and lethal skills could spell his ruin. His arrogance had been his downfall, and now, the smirk that had once twisted his features into a mask of contempt was fading, replaced by a look of dawning realization. But Thomas was still too proud, too ignorant of the danger before him. His sneer returned, though it lacked the confidence it once held. "Oh yeah?" he sneered, his tone mocking. "What are you going to do about it, tough guy?" His words dripped with condescension, but the doubt in his voice was evident now. He was underestimating the danger he now faced, unaware of the volatile power coiled within Tyson. Tyson didn't flinch, didn't even hesitate. Instead, he took a step forward, his presence overwhelming. Officer Thomas took an involuntary step back, his bravado crumbling before the raw, unrelenting strength of the man standing before him. "You're about to find out," Tyson muttered, his voice carrying an undeniable weight as he readied himself for what would come next. As the tension continued to build, the onlookers knew they were witnessing something far more than a confrontation between a man and a cop. It was a clash of egos, a battle between authority and defiance, one that would leave an indelible mark on both men. The story was unfolding, and Officer Thomas was about to learn a very hard lesson about respect and the consequences of his actions. In its suddenness, the two officers stood frozen for a moment, their expressions shifting from disbelief to recognition. They exchanged a brief glance, their faces paling as the weight of the situation dawned on them. They had been prepared to intervene, but now, standing before them was Mike Tyson, the very man they had no intention of tangling with. The realization was almost too much to process in such a charged moment. Tyson, unflinching and unwavering, stood tall above Officer Kane, who was still struggling to regain his composure, dusting himself off in a futile attempt to restore some of his dignity. The crowd around them remained electric, their excitement hanging thick in the air, as the tension that had once been palpable now began to shift. "You got a lot of nerve coming at me like that," Tyson's voice boomed, his words dripping with calm authority. His eyes never left Kane, the cold glint in them sending a clear message. This confrontation was over, and Officer Kane had already lost. "You're lucky I'm not interested in taking this any further," Tyson continued, his tone unwavering as his gaze now briefly flickered toward the two approaching officers, sizing them up with an expression that spoke volumes. The two officers hesitated, clearly intimidated by the situation. They exchanged another quick glance, trying to assess whether they should act. But even they could feel the weight of Tyson's presence, the sheer power emanating from him that made them reconsider the idea of escalating this. Tyson wasn't just some ordinary man. They now understood exactly who they were dealing with. Kane, however, still wasn't ready to admit defeat. His humiliation burned in his chest like a slow, smoldering fire. He was furious, but more than that, he was embarrassed in front of his peers and the crowd. His pride wouldn't allow him to retreat, to back down in front of everyone. With a growl, he turned toward Tyson once more, pushing past his two colleagues and lunging at him with reckless abandon. His movements were sloppy, fueled entirely by anger and desperation. But Tyson was ready. With a swift pivot of his body, Tyson dodged Kane's wild assault, his footwork a masterclass in fluid precision. Without missing a beat, Tyson extended a leg, sweeping Kane's feet from beneath him. The officer was sent crashing to the ground once more, face first into the soft, dew-covered grass. A collective cheer erupted from the onlookers, the entire park now abuzz with excitement, as the officer's downfall unfolded before them. "That's what he gets!" someone yelled from the crowd, their voice full of triumph. The chant spread quickly, others joining in with fervor. "That's what he gets! That's what he gets!" The sound of their voices rising in unison, filled with satisfaction and justice, drowned out the softer sounds of the park, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds. Their enthusiasm was infectious, the crowd united in their praise for Tyson's actions. It was a moment of victory, not just for Tyson, but for everyone who had witnessed the abuse of power in its purest form. Tyson stood tall, his composure steady, unaffected by the cheers or the commotion around him. His eyes, however, remained locked onto Kane, who was still struggling to regain his footing on the grass. Despite his embarrassment, Kane's fury had not been extinguished. his body trembling with the remnants of rage. But before Kane could rise again, two more officers appeared, sprinting across the park to intervene. Their arrival was swift, their footsteps thunderous as they approached the scene. They stopped dead in their tracks when they saw Tyson standing over Kane, his posture unchanged. The realization hit them like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just any confrontation. They had just walked into a storm they couldn't weather. The two officers stood frozen, stunned by the sight before them. There, standing with unyielding authority, was one of the most dangerous men on the planet, Mike Tyson, not a man to be underestimated. The sight of the once proud Officer Kane groaning in humiliation on the ground only added to their disbelief. For a moment the park was silent, as if the entire world had paused to witness the moment of reckoning. The two officers exchanged uncertain looks, unsure of how to proceed, while Tyson remained calm, his eyes never leaving the fallen officer. "You should take your friend and go," Tyson said evenly, his voice carrying the weight of finality. He didn't need to say more. The message was clear. The lesson had been learned, and it was time for Officer Kane to face the consequences of his actions. As the two officers hesitated, the crowd around them continued to roar in approval. Tyson's actions had not only exposed the abuse of power, but it also reminded everyone watching of the importance of standing up to injustice when it rears its ugly head. Face. You have disgraced the uniform and the badge you wear. Your actions today have shown a complete lack of judgment and a blatant abuse of power. You've not only assaulted an innocent man, but you've done so without even understanding who you were dealing with. The crowd, still buzzing with excitement and disbelief, fell into a heavy silence, the weight of the officer's words hanging in the air. The second officer's voice, filled with anger and disapproval, left no room for argument. "You've humiliated yourself, and now it's time for you to face the consequences." Officer Kane, once so sure of his authority, stood there, deflated and crushed. His arrogant posture had completely dissolved, his face now a mask of shame and regret. The realization of the magnitude of his mistake seemed to hit him all at once, and his attempt to salvage any dignity quickly evaporated. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His tongue seemed to betray him as he stumbled over his own thoughts. Mike Tyson, standing tall and unyielding, watched the unraveling of the situation with a quiet, steady intensity. His expression never wavered, his earlier frustration now giving way to a calm, almost inevitable sense of justice. His eyes, however, remained sharp, the fire of righteous indignation still burning within them. Kane's voice eventually broke through the stunned silence, his tone no longer confrontational but pleading. I didn't mean to. I didn't know who you were," he stammered, his words lacking the confidence they once carried. "Please, just let me go. I'll make it right." But Mike Tyson, still resolute, shook his head slightly, his voice firm and unwavering. "You don't get to walk away from this," he said, his gaze cutting through Kane with surgical precision. "You don't get to treat people like this and expect no repercussions." The senior officer, clearly done with the spectacle, turned to the other officers. "Take him in," he commanded coldly. "He'll have his day in court for this. We'll make sure the right people know what he did." As the two officers moved toward Kane, their hands reaching for his arms to detain him, Kane finally seemed to realize the full scope of the consequences he was about to face. His defiance, his arrogance, everything he had once stood for, crumbled into nothing. Mike Tyson, unmoving, surveyed the scene one last time before his attention turned back to the second officer. "I don't need anything from this," he said quietly, his words not meant for Kane but for the officer beside him. "I just want to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. No one should ever be treated this way." The officer nodded, his expression softening with a hint of respect for the man who had not only diffused the situation, but had also stood firm for justice. "You have my word," he replied. "We'll make sure it doesn't happen again." As Kane was led away in cuffs, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their cheers of approval gradually fading into the distance. The park, once filled with tension, returned to its calm state, but there was a lingering sense of something deeper, something more profound that had transpired in those moments. Mike Tyson stood tall, his figure still a beacon of strength and dignity. He didn't need the applause, nor did he seek the admiration. His purpose had been clear: stand up for what is right, even in the face of adversity. And in that moment, as the last of the crowd faded from view, Mike Tyson, aka Mike Tyson, felt a quiet satisfaction settle within him. Justice had been served, and it was a victory for everyone who believed in doing what was right. The scene left an indelible impression on everyone who had witnessed it. Mike Tyson's words and actions not only dismantled Officer Kane's authority, but also sparked a broader movement, one that transcended the moment itself. As the crowd dispersed, still buzzing with the reverberations of the speech, there was a collective sense of empowerment in the air. People felt connected to something greater than themselves, a shared belief in the power of standing up for what is right. The boy, clutching his newly autographed notebook, remained a symbol of that moment, a reminder that heroes come in many forms, and sometimes their impact reaches across generations. For his mother, seeing her son's hero become a symbol of justice was an experience she would carry with her forever. For Mike Tyson, this encounter with the crowd was more than a fleeting interaction. It was a reaffirmation of the values he lived by. His message, simple yet profound, resonated not just in the crowd, but deep within himself as well. He had always understood the weight of influence and the importance of using his platform to champion the causes that mattered most, and today was no exception. As he walked away from the scene, his towering figure framed by the setting sun, it was clear that Mike Tyson had left behind more than just a statement of defiance against abuse of power. He had planted a seed of change, one that would continue to grow as people took his words to heart. His departure into the distance, as the evening light bathed him in gold, symbolized the ongoing journey toward a world where justice and dignity were not just ideals, but lived truths. The memory of this day would linger long after the sun had set, a lasting testament to one man's commitment to fighting for what was right, no matter the cost.